even if you manage to get a warm introduction to the financial decision maker, everyone has gotten so risk averse over the last couple of years that if you haven't first built consensus among that person's team, they're going to send you back to the team. So what that means is there's no longer a decision maker, there's a decision-making committee. And once we realize that there's multiple stakeholders that are involved on a team and perhaps across one or more teams within the company, we realize that whether there's a formal or an informal or an ad hoc, there is for sure a decision-making committee. And understand, from your standpoint, there is no magic tool that's going to consistently tell you exactly who that decision-making committee is. Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem and critical facilities and digital infrastructure, regardless of whether you work for a data center operator like a hyperscaler, colocation provider, edge, modular, or a wholesale data center provider. Perhaps you work for a data center technology or facilities related company, or maybe your company does something related to construction or real estate or investment in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, critical facilities, or perhaps your company specializes in providing some kind of outsourced sales and marketing solutions in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. And regardless of where you sit on the go-to-market team, maybe you work in marketing, sales, like account executive, business development rep, sales development rep, or perhaps you're in post-sales, like client success manager, account manager, or maybe you do something related to products or channel partnerships, or perhaps you're the founder, the leader, the executive, the orchestra conductor, the maestro who brings all of the right people together, all of the right talent onto your team and gets people sitting in the right seats, in the right roles, on the bus, on the rocket ship, playing at the right tempo, going at the right speed, and collaborating to make all of this wonderful go-to-market growth happen in this crazy period of hockey stick growth within data centers, within digital infrastructure, within critical facilities. If this is the first time that you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, welcome. If you are a frequent flyer, if this is not your first time, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us. So what's on the agenda for today? What are the questions that I'm going to be addressing? First up is, how does a data center colocation provider compete against AWS, Amazon Web Services? Then we'll look at how a data center infrastructure optimization consultancy can connect with the right decision makers. After that, we'll turn our attention to decommissioning and equipment recycling. In particular, how a data center decommissioning and equipment recycling company can improve its market price research. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And during the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a DCIM, Data Center Infrastructure Management Solutions business, can compete against the big IT distributors. Didn't realize that was a thing, but okay, for sure, we'll address that. As well as how a data center telecommunications marketing team can target the right people, as well as how a precast concrete manufacturer can keep up with the fast data center segment growth. If you have an idea for a question, a topic, a challenge that you and your team members are grappling with, by all means, feel free to drop that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll consider adding that to the queue for one of our upcoming episodes, one of our upcoming shows for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. If you want to make sure that you stay up to date on new educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our Data Center Sales and Marketing email newsletter that comes to your inbox every Sunday. You can sign up. You can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question, which is, how can a data center colocation provider compete against AWS, Amazon Web Services? How can a colocation provider compete against AWS? And I think from the way that we approach this, the question could have just as easily been asked against any of the other two big hyperscalers, as well as even the second tier players in this space. So it could have been how to compete against Microsoft Azure or how to compete against Google Cloud as a colocation provider. So it really depends on how your business model is set up, who you're targeting, where you're located, and the kind of resources that you bring to the table. To make sure that we're crystal clear on what your company is actually doing with its go-to-market, to make sure that you're addressing this question in the right context, let's go back to the basics. First up, who are your ideal clients? And we'll typically know that because we'll look at your homepage, we'll look at your case study section, look at the logos. Maybe we'll have to go into you'll pull up your CRM, your customer relationship management system, and be able to figure out like what they have in common. So we make sure that we're really crisp on that one-page ideal client profile. So we know geographically where your best clients are located, company size, headcount, how big or how small are they? And I know colocation operators love to talk about their density, their kilowatts, their megawatts per rack, their available space, their efficiency, their cost of electricity, and of course, the size of the facility. But when it comes to prospecting and getting clear on your ideal client profile, we're going to standardize. We're going to want to normalize on company headcount, on number of employees. So how big does that company need to be to afford your minimums for your entry-level colocation offering? And at what point does a company get so prohibitively large that their IT requirements, their financial requirements, the regulatory requirements, sales cycle requirements, integration requirements, whatever it is, are just not a good fit for where your company is today? So be self-aware on both sides, minimum size, maximum size for that employee range within your ideal client profile. And then especially for a company that's principally in the business of colocation or digital infrastructure, private cloud, managed services, however you're positioning your company or however you're approaching that, it's really important to get specific about the industries that you do especially well within and the industries that you do not do well within. And for a lot of colocation operators, this comes down to compliance requirements, regulatory issues, certification issues that are specific to the location in which you're doing business. Like, for example, if you're trying to sell to healthcare or financial services or education or government, it's highly likely that wherever you're located, there's going to be some kind of compliance requirements that you'll need to have to be successful with that segment. Conversely, if you don't meet those requirements, then you may as well exclude that segment from your outbound, from your ads, from your segmentation strategy, so you don't waste resources trying to market and sell to a company that clearly is not going to be a good fit for where your company is today with your colocation business. So get really clear on that ICP, that ideal client profile, with geography, company size, and industry. Good industries and not so good industries, inclusions and exclusions. What's also super important with a colocation operator is most of the time you'll have a hyper-local go-to-market, a hyper-local sales and marketing playbook for companies that can easily get to your facility within 30 or 60 minutes. And then you'll have a virtual, a more digitally focused go-to-market, a more digitally focused sales and marketing playbook for companies that are on the other side of the planet. And they're looking for your location either for latency reasons or governance reasons or something like that. And from there, once you know your ideal client profile, you can build out a target account list, a couple dozen, maybe a couple hundred, perhaps even a few thousand potential companies that would be a great fit for being clients of your colocation facility that fit your ideal client profile well. And then once you know what's going on at the account level, at the company level, we want to segment within there to understand who the ideal people are that we need to build relationships with in these accounts. The most important economic stakeholder, the most important person that shows up on that decision committee, we'll call that person the primary buyer persona. The second most important kind of person, we'll call your secondary buyer persona. On some large accounts, there may even be a third or fourth category of stakeholder, a tertiary buyer persona. And we need to study the heck out of what's going on in that person's world. What are their biggest goals and challenges that are directly and indirectly related to the decision that they would make on where they choose to place their servers, what they choose to do for colocation, or perhaps what they consider doing with cloud, whether it's public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud, or whatever permutation or combination that you're offering as part of your business. So at a high level, when you're looking to compete against Amazon Web Services, there's a couple of different arguments for what determines competition. Over the last couple of years, it's come into focus that the cost savings that was sold as a panacea, that was sold as the silver bullet for why everyone should go public cloud years and years and years ago, has not worked out as well as intended. What's worked out well as intended for the hyperscalers, but not so much for the clients. There's all kinds of horror stories of costs going crazy as people started to ramp up capacity. And now a lot of companies choosing to repatriate. That's the word, right? It came up a couple of years ago, repatriation, where you take assets, where you take data that was formerly living in public cloud and you're bringing it back into a colocation facility, or perhaps even an owned facility, an end user facility for an enterprise data center that you're managing yourself. Because of cost issues. There's also a lot of control issues. There's a lot of compliance issues. There's a lot of flexibility issues. There's a lot of like, hey, how do I know where this is located kind of issues that come up. So what is going to be compelling for the colocation versus public cloud, for the colocation versus AWS, will depend on the stakeholder. For having a conversation with a CFO, a chief financial officer, for sure, they are going to want to talk about costs and budgets. For a meeting with a CTO or someone in infrastructure or engineering role, they'll care more about compliance, they'll care more about latency, they'll care more about uptime, they'll care more about the cybersecurity. So again, your mileage may vary. This is the reason why you do buyer personas. So you segment who your ideal clients are and who are the key stakeholders within those accounts that you want to educate and build trust with over time. And we know each segment is going to have different goals, going to have different motivations, different challenges, different ways that they prioritize the colocation versus public cloud decision-making process. But yeah, for sure, once you start to understand that, it becomes a lot easier to talk about how to stack the decks in your favor in terms of how you educate and build trust throughout the full journey with your most important stakeholders. And that's a big issue as well. So it's not just cost. There's control, being able to physically, they used to call this 10 years ago, server hugging, right? Where you can physically go to the facility and see your server sitting in a rack, sitting in cabinets. That can be a pretty important issue for certain kinds of use cases as well, or just having flexibility. And over time, as we start to move into these very latency specific applications, or even where governance is an issue, then yeah, knowing the precise location where your assets are located can make a really big difference. What you'll also tend to find is, unless you're a huge enterprise client, the level of attention, the level of service, your escalation path within a small to mid-sized colocation operator is going to be like night and day compared to buying from a huge hyperscaler. Yeah, sure. If you're a Fortune 50, Fortune 500 kind of company, most of the big hyperscalers will put in a ton of account management resources on making sure that you're happy. But if you're spending a couple $1,000s a month, a couple $100s a month, the question is, where are you going to get a better level of attention from a locally owned and operated colocation provider with 3 or 4 locations in your region that has space, rented space in a few other locations in other parts of the country for geographic diversity, or from AWS, or from Microsoft Azure, or from Google Cloud? Where are you going to have more flexibility on being able to purchase additional amenities, managed services? Where are you going to be able to physically go and work from a business continuity, disaster recovery standpoint, if you need to go in and physically rebuild a server, or even have physical access to that server? So there's a lot of issues that come up. There's price, there's flexibility, there's compliance, there's security, there's latency. A lot of what you emphasize in your messaging on your website, on your product marketing and your sales enablement and your educational events and your event marketing is going to depend greatly on how big or small your company is, how big or small your prospects companies are, what industries they tend to be located in, and what use cases they have most often for why they're co-locating servers in your facility in the first place. And the closer you can get to understanding these motivations and understanding what makes them tick, the easier it is for you to have a stronger and a more compelling argument. But a back of the napkin way of approaching all of this is just to recognize that most of your buyers don't buy colocation or cloud the way that they did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was very common for IT buyers to spend about half of their buyer's journey, half of your sales cycle, with someone from your sales team. At the time, CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, that's now owned by Gartner, found that 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact, was over before vendor contact. Those days are long, long gone. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, more Gen Zs and millennials in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people getting comfortable working from home. All of that accelerated the self-driven, self-service buyer's journey to the point where that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. So 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens without a member of your sales team being in the room. And wow, does that change the nature of how you approach, how you explain what needs to happen for the person that wants to know how your colocation compares to AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. Because what that means is we can't show up as a vendor anymore. Because if we show up as a vendor that's just focused on the transaction, we're excluded for all but the last 17% of the research and decision-making process, meaning that they've pretty much made up their mind before you ever meet them. That's a really, really dangerous proposition. The way we earn our way back in there is, instead of showing up as an account executive or sales development rep or business development rep, we need to show up as teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors with a huge, huge emphasis on trust, maybe even being seen as thought leaders. So it's incredibly important that we understand what's going on in our prospects and in our clients' worlds, and we show up in a way that infuses ourselves into their learning and development, their professional development, how they get up to speed on anything and everything having to do with IT infrastructure, cloud, colocation, anything that impacts their business. And the better job you do with showing up multiple times in those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, so that they see your client-facing team members as geniuses, as experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with colocation and cloud, the better off everything works. So at the end of the day, if you want to truly knock it out of the park when it comes to a colocation provider competing against a hyperscaler like Amazon or Microsoft or Google, or even some of the next tier down, it's super important that you get as close to possible to your prospects and clients, that you really deeply understand your buyer personas. And if you have a channel partner program, that's a buyer persona as well. And you need to understand what are the motivations of the MSPs, the managed service providers, the VARs, the evaluated resellers, the integrators, the consultancies, the master agents. You need to understand each of those segments, what they care most about when it comes to how they act as an extension of your sales and services team for colocation. And again, the better job you can do at educating and building trust and providing value throughout the full buyer's journey, the better job you're going to do across the board with competing, not only initially, but competing on an ongoing basis. So you have long-term retention. Because even if you have a long-term 24, 36 month or whatever colocation contract, just understand that if you're dropping the ball, they're going to be looking for the exits. And you can do a good job of blocking the exits, but at the end of the day, if they're looking for the exits, you're not getting the review. You're not getting the positive word of mouth. You're certainly not expanding that account. If it's a channel partner, you're really shooting yourself in the foot with burning that relationship and not getting access to the rest of their client base. So it's super important that we think through where we're going to get a great fit Who's that ideal client? How do we educate and build trust with them throughout that full buyer's journey? So by the time they get to the point that they're ready for a sales conversation, there's already very, very strong know, like, and trust that's heavily stacking the decks in the favor of your company, because that's gives a great onboarding, gives great account management, great land and expand, great account expansion potential. A lot of the problems that prevent that from happening start really, really early on with being absent from how they learn, from how they're getting educated about cloud, how they're learning about colocation. So show up as the teacher, the expert, the consultant, the trusted advisor. And a lot of these building blocks fall into place pretty naturally, as long as you're willing to play the long game with being a data center colocation provider that's competing against Amazon Web Services. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button on whatever platform you're watching on. So what do we got for the next question up? How does a data center infrastructure optimization consultancy connect with the right decision maker? How can a data center infrastructure infrastructure optimization consultancy that specializes in optimizing infrastructure, how can they connect with the right decision maker? RIGHT, the proper decision maker. So first up is a mindset issue. The mindset issue, before we get really deep into this, is to recognize that the days of there being one decision maker who makes the decision completely in a vacuum without consulting everyone else is pretty much long gone in anything but the tiniest of tiny startups. Once you get to the point that you're selling to a reasonably sophisticated, even small and medium-sized business, let alone a mid-market, let alone an enterprise, even if you manage to get a warm introduction to the financial decision maker, everyone has gotten so risk averse over the last couple of years that if you haven't first built consensus among that person's team, they're going to send you back to the team. So what that means is there's no longer a decision maker, there's a decision-making committee. And once we realize that there's multiple stakeholders that are involved on a team and perhaps across one or more teams within the company, we realize that whether there's a formal or an informal or an ad hoc, there is for sure a decision-making committee. And understand, from your standpoint, there is no magic tool that's going to consistently tell you exactly who that decision-making committee is. Sure, you can go into LinkedIn Sales Navigator, which is a great investment, by the way, if you're looking to grow your data center related business in mid-market and enterprise and show up consistently as a trust builder, as an educator, doing all the best practices well for data center go-to-market. So that for sure, there's a button that you can click that tells you decision makers, but it doesn't know your context for your business. It doesn't perfectly know how their business looks at the context of your business. So yeah, sure, it can help. You can filter on seniority and know who the C-levels are and who the vice presidents are, who the directors are, who the managers are. But again, some of the limitations with that are that LinkedIn, like most similar tools, uses a fair amount of machine learning to infer what's going on, and it doesn't always get it perfect. But the big thing is it doesn't truly understand your business model, and it doesn't understand how that particular company would interact with a company that is in your business model that provides infrastructure optimization. Because as much as LinkedIn improved a couple of years ago and went from having roughly 150 or so industry classifications to now having well over 400, it did not get granular enough to the point where there's a category for infrastructure, let alone infrastructure optimization consultancy. So that can certainly help a little bit. However, I would tell you the best way to really figure out who that decision maker is and who is on the decision committee is to make the investments that you pretty much need to make anyway to compete and win in today's self-driven buyer's journey. What is the self-driven buyer's journey, and why is it so relevant to a company that's focused on infrastructure optimization consulting? The self-driven buyer's journey means that your ideal clients, your stakeholders within those companies research and make their purchase decisions today very, very differently than they did compared to as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was quite common that your sales team was in there for roughly half of the sales cycle, roughly half of their buyer's journey. Those days are long gone. Now, even if you do everything perfectly, you're largely not going to be in there until it's just about decision-making time. Gartner found 83% of a typical buyer's journey is over before vendor contact, is over before they're willing to talk with someone from your sales team. So your best case scenario, you're only in there in the final 17%. So what that means is if you don't change what you're doing, you're largely out of the consideration set and have no way of having a meaningful conversation with that prospect or client or influencing the direction they go in for that first 83%. That's the bad news. The good news is it actually is within your control, because companies that are client-centric, are partner-centric, and really understand who these stakeholders are on the decision committee, who the different kinds of roles are and what they care most about, and are consciously delivering value proactively around each segment's biggest goals and biggest challenges that they actually have, it can have a game-changing impact for your company, not only getting on the short list, staying on the short list, but in many cases, when you do this so well, you start to knock others off of the short list who would have been in the consideration set because they're learning so much from your client-facing team members that are experts in optimizing data center infrastructure. So how do we figure out who the ideal clients are? How do we figure out who these personas are? How do we figure out who's sitting on these decision committees? If you have a brand new company, a lot of the biggest challenge of standing up and launching and scaling a new company is getting to the point that you know answers to some of these questions, getting to product market fit, where you know the ideal products and services for infrastructure optimization that they're purchasing from you, and what those products cost and how frequently they buy them and the duration of those terms. For an established business that already has product market fit and go-to-market fit, meaning that you have successfully scaled marketing and sales, meaning that you have well built out marketing and sales teams in place that show up on the about section of your website, that show up on your LinkedIn company page and other places, you've successfully passed that milestone. Perhaps you even have channel partner market fit. That means that you've successfully taken your direct sales model and you've scaled successfully an indirect sales model where you have managed service providers, MSPs, integrators, other kinds of technology consultants that are acting as an extension of your sales and services arm. And you know that's working well because not only do you have a whole separate /partner or /channel section on your website, but you're able to point to multiple channel partners who've been working with your company for a significant period of time and love what they're getting from the partnership that they have with your company. So there's product market fit, there's go-to-market fit, there's channel partner market fit. Once you have 2 or more of those in place, you'll have a sense of who these ideal clients are, where they're located, how big or small their companies are, the industries they tend to be located in, and who are the kinds of stakeholders that you communicate with, that you meet with before, during, and after purchase. They show up in your case studies, they show up in your logos, they for sure show up in your CRM system. So once we know who's the most important and second most important, we'll designate each of those categories, each of those segments as a primary, a secondary buyer persona, maybe even a tertiary buyer persona. And then with each of those segments, we need to do our homework. We need to do our research to understand what's going on in their worlds. What are their biggest goals? What are they struggling with the most? And most of all, we need that information in their own words, not what you think those words are, but what their words actually are. So we can't guess. Sure, talk to some of your internal team members who've been doing this a while, and that can be a small part of your input for building out and documenting your buyer personas, but that should not be the majority of where your research comes from. The majority of your research needs to come from face-to-face conversations, video conversations, surveys, studying their search and social footprint that they leave behind, studying all the data that's in your CRM. We need to get the consensus on each of those segments, 4, 5, 6 biggest goals that are directly individual goals, team goals, company goals that are directly related to optimizing data center infrastructure and what's stressing them out, what they're struggling with the most, what are their biggest challenges when it comes to optimizing data center infrastructure. And once we know that, that should drive everything going forward with your messaging, with your communication and your events, your website copywriting, your product marketing, your sales enablement resources, your content strategy, your events, your educational event strategy, your ads, your email marketing, your social, everything should revolve around the biggest goals and challenges that each of your segments have. And when you do this correctly and you start to have your own educational events, like have a great ongoing webinar series every month or more frequent. These could be traditional webinars, these could be virtual summits, these could be live streams, or you may also be doing these events in person. Breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, pretty much the same content, except instead of streaming it through Zoom or on 24 or Goldcast or GoToWebinar, whatever, it's up on the TV or on the LCD screen in your classroom or in your conference room in your facility, or if you're doing a roadshow or something like that. What messes up a lot of people is when you do this well, you do not need large numbers of attendees or registrants for the return on investment for this program to be quite staggering. Because the goal isn't to have a large number, it's to have the right people attending and for them to learn a ton about how they can do their job better. For them to walk away from that experience with, wow, your company has some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to optimizing data center infrastructure. And they learn that because they spent 45 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, whatever it is, not just once, but multiple times, because you made this a series of events. And you made this so good that over time, when you said, hey, Bob, hey, Sally, I see that you registered for our breakfast seminar. I see that you registered for our webinar next week on data center infrastructure optimization best practices, but we know it takes a village. Typically, this is a team sport. It's typically people involved from operations, engineering, infrastructure, cybersecurity, finance, compliance. So with that in mind, who else would benefit from attending? Who else should register? Who else should watch the recording? You'd be shocked just by prompting your registrants how they're like, oh, yeah, sure. Because at that point, they're not formally recommending your company. They're just saying to their coworkers, they're saying to their colleagues, they're saying to their boss, hey, there's this great event coming up. Multiple stakeholders, multiple people from our company should attend. It looks like it's going to be really valuable. And they do. And when you do that, guess what you discover? When you look down at your event registration confirmations or your CRM or wherever you're capturing this, aside from like, wow, that's really cool. 4, 5, 6 people from the same company all just registered in the last 30 minutes or an hour. They must be talking about us. But teams that learn together grow together. And a lot of your success in having a positive outcome, both pre-sales and post-sales, is driving alignment, getting everyone on the same page. And it is so much easier to do that when you're able to intercept them really, really early on in the buyer's journey. In the formative stages, when you can use educational events to massively influence how they navigate your category, how to frame all of the other options that are in front of them. And when you do this well enough, not only will you start to see more and more people from the same company coming back to your events, you are realizing that this isn't one and done, right? You need to quarterly, monthly, whatever is the right frequency for your company. But they have 28 touch points that they're going to go through between complete stranger and purchase decision. How many of those touch points do you want to be in on? I would tell you that you want to buy way more than 1 or 2 lottery tickets. You want to be in there more than 1 or 2 times. You really, this is a prioritized segment, in there early and often, in the right context, not as a vendor, but in there as experts, as teachers, as consultants, as trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders when it comes to optimizing infrastructure. And when you do this well, you stay on the short list. You start to proactively knock other companies off the short list. And guess what? You figure out who's on the decision committee, because now you have met multiple stakeholders from the same company. And most importantly, they now trust you. And because they trust you, they are willing to share trusted information. This is a theme that I've seen come up consistently over and over and over again, especially in infrastructure, especially among data center operators, in how they're rethinking the role of their account executives, their business development reps in their companies to be seen as true experts. Because when they're seen as true experts, they can have conversations, much better quality conversations with stakeholders where this trusted information is being shared. That's how you figure out who the decision makers are, who the decision committee members are, and are able to better address proactively what each different stakeholder cares about. So all of this is joined part and parcel to educating and building trust throughout the full buyer's journey. Sure, use good tools, use a CRM system to keep everything organized, have a target account list, have good drop-down lists on your forms, segment your CRM, have a sales navigator account, do all of those best practices. But nothing is going to compare to the impact of having prospects and clients that you educate and build trust with and stay with throughout the full buyer's journey. That's how you figure out who the decision maker is. That's how you figure out who the other people are on the decision committee. And that's how you win them over one by one individually and as a team, because you're using content and educational events to drive alignment proactively, as opposed to just waiting to the last minute. Because if you just wait to the last minute and you haven't met them until they're 83% of the way making up their mind, you're not going to be in a position to reshape their purchase criteria. It's too late. Someone else got in there. So my insights, best practices on all of this is to get in early, get in often with the right people, in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so that the most important people in that company see your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with optimizing data center infrastructure. So that's how a data center infrastructure optimization consultancy can connect with the right decision makers. Okay, what do we got? Next question up. By the way, if you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-To-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you smash the like button. Hit the like button. Let us know. Share the love. Next question up is about decommissioning and equipment recycling. How does a data center decommissioning and equipment recycling company improve their market price research? How does a data center decommissioning and equipment recycling company improve its market price research? Yeah, that is a fantastic question, because at the end of the day, your ability to buy and sell these assets is a huge driver of how financially successful your company is going to be. So for sure, you need to understand the marketplaces that you operate within. You need to have access to a certain amount of this public facing data. But at the end of the day, improving your market price research is a lot of having good relationships with prospects and clients where you can anticipate what's going to be coming up for decommissioning and recycling on the supply side and what they're going to need to be purchasing on the demand side. So it depends for a lot of companies that focus on decommissioning and equipment recycling what you specialize in, because there are certain companies that just deal with like server hardware and drives and switches, like telecommunications equipment. And then there's other companies that do that, plus they do all the stuff on the facility side. They do the switchway, they do the bus stuff, they do the generators, they do chillers. They do everything that gets pulled out of a decommissioned data center, way beyond just racks and cabinets and the physical IT assets that are there. So a lot of how deep your knowledge is and your value and your specialization depends on your expertise in each one of these categories. And when you realize that there's 52 different segments within the data center ecosystem, and there's 5 different kinds of operators, hopefully you realize relatively quickly that it's impossible to be an expert in all 52 and all 57 different these segments, like literally impossible. However, you may find that among those 52 segments, among the 5 different kinds of operators, you get pretty good at it over an extended period of time in 3, 4, 5 of these areas. And then you also realize that you're pretty good at these 3, 4, 5 areas, but you don't know much about like generators. You don't know much about power and cooling. You certainly don't know much about alternative energy. So then you go and you find one or more experts in those areas who have worked as a consultant, who've worked as an integrator, that knows roughly what the current technology is, roughly what these things cost at the beginning of the life cycle. They know roughly how many years there is in the life cycle. They know how to properly inspect this equipment as it's getting pulled out to make sure that it's in actually saleable, certifiable kind of condition for reselling. And they know roughly what the market is for used, refurbished, certified. And it depends on, of course, on the category that you operate within. But in terms of getting the market price research, I don't know that there is a magic database that's going to give you access to everything that's out there. Some people may use something as basic as just looking on eBay for the second-hand market for certain kinds of categories of equipment. Other people may be looking on Amazon for new and used. Of course, more specialized marketplaces over time, depending on how big your e-commerce operation is that you scale. You may have thousands or tens of thousands of SKUs, tens of thousands of products where you can glean some general trends and know what you're really doing. But at the end of the day, a huge part of your business model is getting good at knowing what's hot, not hot like stolen, but like, what are in demand products and services, what they tend to cost new, what the life cycle is like, how many years they have as they kind of depreciate where they can be refurbished and turned over to someone else, and what prices you can afford to buy at because of what prices you think you can sell at. There's an interesting opportunity on a lot of this that's accelerating right now, because as AI requires a lot more power density, requires a lot more cooling. Sure, there's demand for various kinds of liquid cooling solutions and direct chip liquid cooling. But at the end of the day, you're ending up with a lot of these legacy facilities that don't seem like they ought to be legacy facilities, meaning they were built 3 or 4 years ago instead of in the past year or two. So you have this 3 or 4 year old facility that, if it wasn't for OpenAI and NVIDIA's going from being a graphics card builder to powering tens of millions of GPUs, if it wasn't for that, these colocation facilities would otherwise have a couple more years of usable service. So some are being put out to pasture prematurely. And if you think about the hand-me-down approach on facilities that's existed for the better part of now 10 or 15 years, it was quite common that a hyperscaler would decommission and a colocation operator would buy it. And as a national colocation provider decommissioned a couple of years after that, a regional might buy it. And as a regional got tired of a facility, third or fourth hand-me-down already at that point, an independently owned colocation provider may have purchased that. And if there's end user data centers, pretty much the same thing, depending on the company's size, depending on how motivated of a seller there is, you have different levels of sophistication for who's buying the actual facility. It's the same basic idea with the equipment reselling, the equipment recycling, the decommissioning part. And sure, of course, if you are in IT asset disposition and you're on the IT side, yeah, you need to get really good at secure data erasure. That's a given. You need to be able to give the certificates that make the clients understand that it was compliant and secure and wiped and everything like that. That's a given. You also have to decide as a company, philosophically, like where you are in terms of circularity, in terms of being able to get more life out of everything, in terms of sustainability. And some of that may depend on physically where you're located, your country, region where you're located. Some of it may depend on your mission and values of your company, but that certainly plays a role in all of this. But in terms of market price research, I don't know that there's a magic answer aside from just getting closer to your clients, getting closer to understanding in your category what's really in demand right now. What was in demand 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that companies are starting to sunset, decommission, shut down, and not have as much useful life as they had for in the past, and understand, when a hyperscaler takes a couple hundred servers out of commission, Who's the one who would want to purchase those next? And when a national or a global colocation operator takes a couple hundred servers or switches out of commission, who's the next logical pass me down, hand me down on all of that? And what did the value look like at initial purchase? What does it look like at the time that transaction is happening? What you can afford to buy it at? What you anticipate being able to sell at? There's models on this. Sure, you can use something as basic as a spreadsheet on this, but this is a very data-driven part of the data center ecosystem that's a lot like being a commodity broker, right? You're constantly buying and selling and flipping potentially millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions in inventory in these categories. So you got to really, really understand the categories quite well. I don't know that there's a magic answer on this for improving your market research. A lot of getting access to this trusted information, I think, comes down to having trusted relationships with your prospects and clients. So the basics of being seen as a trusted brand, having great reviews, having great educational resources, having great educational events. All of that leads to your prospects and clients wanting to spend time with members of your client-facing team. Reputation, branding is a huge, huge part of getting access to this kind of information. So that you certainly could do as well. First cousin of putting out great thought leadership research is you certainly could gather this data and publish general trends on the state of data center decommissioning, the state of data center equipment recycling, to give your prospects and clients exclusive access to baseline ideas of what things tend to cost. There's a lot of ways to approaching this, but I don't know that there's a magic answer on improving how you do market price research, aside from just getting closer to your prospects and clients. But on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, I do interview people from time to time that are in decommissioning and IT asset disposition. And this is for sure a great topic that we'll continue to talk about. So that brings us to the halfway point on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value so far from this week's episode, make sure that you hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic, a question, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to drop that in the comments. We'll take a real quick break from our sponsor, and then we'll be back with the second half of this week's show.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. I'm thrilled to have you with us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. What's up next? Next has to do with data center infrastructure management software, DCIM. So how does a DCIM solutions business compete against big IT distributors? How does a data center infrastructure management software company compete against big distributors? So what's super interesting about this is, by big distributors, I assume they're like talking about like TD SYNNEX and Ingram and Arrow, like companies like that. They're not primarily in the business of developing and selling data center infrastructure management software. So I think, unless I'm missing something, and if I am, feel free to let me know in the comments or send me a note after this episode. But the reality is, I think what they're talking about is that they would prefer to have a direct relationship with their end users, with their channel partners, as opposed to going through the big IT distributors, because they don't like the terms and the trade-offs that come with selling through tiered distribution. And what's super interesting about that pushback is 20 years ago, you may not have had a choice. It just wasn't cost effective for a company at a certain size to do anything but having tier distribution, having channel partners purchasing your shrink wrap software and early on even some of your SaaS licenses through anything but distribution. But what we're starting to see is we're moving into a world where it's not really unique anymore or incredibly challenging to have your own ability to sell directly through your site. We're also seeing the emergence of marketplaces and ecosystems where, depending on end user preferences, depending on channel partner preferences, there is massive volume going through walled ecosystems and marketplaces owned by all the hyperscalers and dozens of similar companies. And in terms of getting to efficient unit economics and looking at how inefficient, in some cases, direct models and indirect models can be, marketplaces are considered a huge part of how software and how technology in general are now being purchased. And this has caused, over the last couple of years, a lot of channel chiefs, a lot of channel organizations in and around all different parts of IT to rethink how they go about recruiting and retraining, and most of all, compensating their channel partners. And it's not particularly new. It's been around probably 4 or 5 years at this point. The idea that you have transacting and non-transacting channel partners. A transacting channel partner means they're the ones that actually close the deal, hold the paper, purchase the inventory, and make a spread between what the client's paying for your DCIM software licenses and what you were able to purchase that at. That's kind of the traditional model that's been around like decades. Back 20, 25 years ago, when I evaluated reseller system integrator kinds of businesses and had active accounts with Ingram and Tech Data, this is a very, very well-worn model. What's more come into focus the last couple of years is where you look at 7, 8, 10 different technology provider relationships that every even mid-market company has, and potentially dozens of technology provider relationships that enterprises have. In some cases, they're purchasing that license from a company that's not yours. And the ISVs, the software vendors, the companies that make this DCIM software, recognize that there's certain companies that are good at closing that initial deal. And there's some companies that are better at installing, configuring, training, and providing ongoing support on that. And there's, even within that category, there's some that are really good at the initial onboarding and the initial customization and expansion. And then, they want to do that 100, 200 times a month, but they don't want to be responsible for maintaining that relationship every single month for the next 12, 18, 24, 36 months, whatever it is. So they're coming, these channel chiefs, these channel organizations are coming up with much more creative ways of recruiting, training, compensation models that their board, their CFOs find tolerable, and that their channel partners find compelling. I think for a lot of companies that are relatively new to standing up a channel partner organization, a lot of times they're attracted to the idea that they're going to have an extension of their sales, extension of their services without fixed overhead. However, the big however with that is what they're not thinking about is when you hire your own account managers, when you hire your own account executives, they work for you 40, 50, 60 hours a week, 100% of the time. There's no divided loyalty. There's no competing for attention. They're all in with your company. With channel partners, it's pretty much the opposite scenario. It's very, very likely that when you recruit MSPs, VARs, integrators, consultancies that specialize in installing data center technology and data center software, it's very, very likely that they're involved in multiple channel partner programs. And because of that, and they have lots of different clients, because of that, their attention is fractured. And getting them to pay attention to you is not always the easiest thing to overcome. It's not always the easiest objective to accomplish. And being a lot more focused on what they care about, being client-centric, being channel partner-centric, understand their drivers, their motivations, their biggest goals and challenges, and showing up in a way that earns their trust, where you're educating and building trust with those channel partners, goes a long way to getting those VARs, those MSPs, those integrators to want to spend time with client-facing members of your team, because you're not always trying to close them. That's one of the biggest complaints that channel partners have when it comes to channel account managers, CAMs, and channel consultants, is they feel like they're always trying to close them. It's kind of like, imagine someone out on a first date and the person they're out on a first date is relentlessly obnoxious about trying to escalate and speed up that relationship to a place where the other person doesn't think that first date should go. It's the same thing many times with selfish behaviors on the part of channel organizations. So be realistic. Be realistic that this is a long game. And when you do this right, you could have channel partners that are with you for way, way longer than even your average employee retention. So play the long game with all of this. So if you're trying to compete against big IT distributors, when it comes to being the ones that are training and providing this incredible level of pre-sales and co-selling support with your channel partners and how they engage with their clients, you need to do way, way better than what they can get from the big distributors, because the distributors do have some support with that as well, but you need to provide several levels above and beyond that, because you care way more about that relationship, because they have a lot more value to your company than they would have for a big IT distributor where they're one of tens of thousands of accounts for that company, whereas the channel partner is probably one of a couple dozen channel partners with your company, or maybe even a smaller number. So you can afford to invest a lot more resources. You can afford for them to get access to senior executives within your company, maybe even your CEO or your CTO, depending on your company's size. You can afford to treat them so well that it almost feels like they're ad hoc, as they're unofficial members of your team. And this takes a while to get right, but when you're focused on helping your channel partners grow their businesses better and making them look like a hero in front of their clients, great things can happen. So at the end of the day, I think it's super important that if you're talking about competing against big IT distributors for your data center infrastructure management software, it's important to have a realistic time frame, a realistic timeline for what it takes to build these trusted long-term relationships with VARs and MSPs and integrators or consultancies that have expertise in your area. This is not an overnight fix. If you need to generate revenue this month or this quarter, you needed to be doing what I'm talking about right now 6, 12, 18 months ago. Because if you're trying to recruit and immediately high pressure that channel partner into closing, you're going to do the exact opposite of what you're trying to do. That's not a trusted relationship. Trust takes time. You want to be with them throughout the journey. What I found in a lot of segments within the data center, critical facilities, digital infrastructure ecosystem is the level of support that they're getting from your internal resources should be so incredibly valuable that it feels like you almost should be charging for this in terms of professional services. And maybe you need to charge something for this in terms of channel partner onboarding or having professional services that they can resell. But the support that they're getting from your channel consultants, from your other client-facing team members, your channel account managers, should be so incredibly valuable to their business as well as their clients' businesses that there's no doubt in their mind that you're looking out for them and you're looking out for their clients. The concept of selling to versus selling through is very, very real. Co-selling is a really, really important concept. And getting this culture right and getting your values aligned with playing the long game. And this is something that needs to be talked about among your board, among your investors, among your CFO, because the unit economics on channel partner programs can be outrageously valuable. It's pretty well known. For example, there's been some remarkable success stories. If you look at Microsoft's dominant position in the marketplace and why it's every once in a while been able to make some strategic missteps, some of which were really, really expensive. The reason why Microsoft is still standing, a large part is for decades, going back to the 1980s and 1990s. They have been investing incredible amounts of resources in building this incredibly loyal channel partner base. And fair disclosure, actually did a significant amount of work with Microsoft channel partner programs in the late 90s and early 2000s. And Cisco has been modeling that for a long time as well. Dell has an interesting history with channel partner ecosystems too. In the 1990s, they used to run big ads, cut out the middleman, go direct with Dell, and then they changed their tune on that in the early 2000s. They haven't looked back since. In the SaaS space, it's widely believed that the reason that HubSpot is still an independently owned company, and I hope I didn't make this podcast recording less evergreen by stating that, but if you look at who its direct competitors were in the 2010s, you had Pardot that became part of Salesforce. You had Marketo, became part of Adobe. You had Eloqua that became part of Oracle. The reason HubSpot is still an independently owned entity may be in no small part to the fact that, was it the last time I looked, it was about 40% of its annual revenue comes from channel partners. Channel partners can be incredibly valuable. It can be a great way to lessen your dependence on big IT distributors as a smaller mid-sized data center infrastructure management DCIM software company, but it involves playing the long game. Are you ready to play the long game? These are big culture decisions that need to start at the top. Next question. How does a data center telecommunications marketing team target the right people? So how does a marketing team for a data center telecommunications provider target the right people? So just to be clear, most telecommunications companies don't call themselves data center telecommunications companies. They call themselves telecommunication providers, telecommunications carriers, of which data centers, digital infrastructure, are a really important segment. So much so that it's very, very common that there's entire teams that are dedicated to just things like interconnects, IAXs, internet exchanges, meet-me rooms, peering, all of the terminology, all of the working relationships that powers how telecommunications intersects with all different kinds of critical facilities, all different kinds of data centers, regardless of whether they're colocation facilities where having carrier neutrality and lots of choice and competition is super important. Hyperscale facilities where you typically would want to have multiple carriers for redundancy and fault tolerance, stability, reliability reasons. And then there's edge, where again, you certainly want reliability, but latency is incredibly important. Modular, kind of the first cousin amalgamation of like a little bit of edge, a little bit of colocation, that has its own unique telecommunications needs because it can be moved around. You need the flexibility to get the telecommunications lines in there faster than fast many times. I imagine over time as things like Starlink become more valuable, that it will be a really, really good stand-in for data centers that you can literally put on a tractor trailer and move around. And then wholesale facilities where it's more up to your end users, the tenants that are occupying that, to decide what they want to do with telecommunications. So yeah, telecommunications carriers largely don't consider themselves data center telecommunications companies. They consider themselves telecommunications companies that happen to do a lot of work with the data centers themselves and the clients, the tenants that are within the data centers. So how does the marketing team in there target the right people, the correct people, the proper people? So your mileage may vary, your answer may vary, because a lot of deciding who's right for your company may be completely different for a different telecommunications company across town, across the state, across the country, or that you even happen to partner with. So typically when it comes to targeting the right people, we need to understand where you've been successful in the past. And for most telecommunications companies, like most data center technology related companies, typically you can look at the logos on your homepage, you can look at your case studies section, you can look at your reviews and your testimonials, and you start to get a sense of the kinds of companies, the kinds of stakeholders within those companies that have gotten the most value from being clients of your telecommunications company. In addition to that, there's almost certainly going to be additional data sitting in your customer relationship management, your CRM system, that also gives some clues as to what kinds of clients, what kinds of stakeholders within those clients are happiest and most profitable for you, where they're happy and you're profitable. So it's a win-win situation all around. And once we have that data, we should be able to get really crisp about our simple one-page ideal client profile, or ICP. And within that ideal client profile, we should be able to indicate geographically where the right clients, where the right prospects are located. Is it just in a certain city or metro area? Is it in an entire state or country? Is it an entire state or province? Is it an entire country? Is it multiple countries? Is it an entire continent? And again, your answers are going to vary. What's right for you, what's proper for you may not be right for the telecommunications provider across town or that you compete with. But at the end of the day, figure out geographically where they're located, what they have in common. Also, how big or how small are their companies? When you do best, are you selling to SMB, small and medium-sized businesses that are in the data center operator space? Are you selling to mid-market data center operators and mid-market end users of data centers that have their own data centers? Or do you do primarily well with enterprises? Or do you do well with all the above? If you do all three in small, medium, and large company sizes, SMB, mid-market, and enterprise, it's very, very likely that you're going to need a different go-to-market, and you're going to need a different marketing playbook and a different sales playbook and a different sales team for the different contexts, the different context in terms of company size. Why? Because of average deal size and the number of stakeholders that are involved and the average sales cycle length. And it's very, very common to have huge differences in these basic unit economics, depending on how big or how small the end client is or the channel partner is. So it's very common for the marketing team, for go-to-market, for this chief revenue officer, however you're organizing this, to decide that, hey, we need a different ideal client profile, or we segment that ideal client profile, and a different marketing playbook, a different sales playbook, and for sure, different account executives, different sales development reps that are selling a high volume of relatively low cost deals versus selling a very low volume of extremely high ticket deals. If you're selling 7 and 8 figure telecommunications deals, it's possible you're working on those deals for not just months, but potentially years. Whereas if you're selling $400 a month, $1,000 a month, $2,000 a month telecommunications or your local currency equivalent, if you're selling smaller telecommunications deals to small and medium-sized businesses, you can't afford to have your account executives and your sales development reps working on deals for years. The expectation typically is that they're going to close within a matter of weeks, maybe a couple of months, perhaps even considerably sooner. And a lot of what you're trying to do is to understand that journey, proactively provide content and educational events that help accelerate the right people through the right journey. But at the end of the day, like the right people, the correct people, the proper people requires that your company, your telecommunications company, have answers to some of the basic questions that show up when you've achieved product market fit, when you've achieved go-to-market fit, when you've achieved channel partner market fit. To kind of recap with this, when you have product market fit, you know exactly the telecommunications products and services that your ideal clients purchase from you, the price points they pay, the duration of the terms, how often they buy, your average sales cycle length, your margins, 4, 5, 6 different key things that define who your clients are, what they buy from your company, and that helps to have certainty that your investors, your finance executives have some certainty as to what's going on in the business. And usually from an outsider's perspective, that manifests itself because we can look at your logos, we can look at your case studies, your public facing assets, your marketing assets, and start to infer where you've done well. The next step above and beyond that, and that's usually a startup kind of issue. Once your company is beyond 10, 15, 20 employees, you need to have passed that. Otherwise, you're not going to get the funding to go to the next level. The next level beyond that, typically what LinkedIn would call 11 to 50 employees or 50 to 200 employees, is you're trying to get from product market fit to go to market fit. This is where you've graduated beyond needing founders or senior executives in the company to sell every deal, and you successfully are scaling marketing and sales. You've built good, repeatable sales process for various different kinds of segments. You have reps that you hire and onboard smoothly. A significant amount of your team is achieving and exceeding quota. And you have confidence that as you are deploying more capital into your sales and marketing process, that you're going to get a significant amount of that being successful. That's go-to-market fit. your jet fuel is actually going in the right places. Channel partner market fit means, in addition to all of that, having answers on what's working for a direct sales force, you've successfully set up an indirect sales force. You've successfully recruited and onboarded channel partners, and they've been with your company long enough in your channel partner program that they're achieving success as well. They've onboarded multiple clients of theirs. They're getting sales compensation. They're happy about the sales compensation. Their clients are happy. They're looking like heroes to their clients. These are showing up in channel partner case studies on your website. There's a well built out channel partner section. So these are some of the key milestones that need to happen as a telecommunications company goes from new to established to scaling to growing, regardless of whether you have a direct and indirect model or direct and indirect models, which is quite common. It's just additional buyer personas that you're supporting. So at the end of the day, with understanding who these right people are, it's once you've gotten unit economics and knowing what's working versus what's not working, it's a matter of looking to do more of that. What do I mean by that? So let's say, for example, your direct sales team has determined that they're doing really well selling to mid-market manufacturing companies in your region, in your states, that are roughly a certain size of, they're defining mid-market as like anywhere from 200 to 1,000 employees. And when they sell to these mid-market manufacturing companies, their telecommunications deal is usually expensive enough that a secondary stakeholder is in the CFO or VP of finance. A primary stakeholder is probably a CTO or a VP of infrastructure or VP of IT operations or something like that. And they have an idea at this company size, how big or how small the IT organization is and who are the key roles in this manufacturing company. At a couple hundred employees, maybe there's 5 or 10 people in total in the IT organization. So they know the roles. And within those roles, within those job functions, they know who weighs in, who provides input on what direction they're going to go with telecommunications. And because of that, you start to get a sense of like, okay, who's the most important economic stakeholder? That's your primary buyer persona. Who's the second most important kind of economic stakeholder within this? That's your secondary buyer persona. And depending on how sophisticated your go-to-market playbook, your marketing sales playbook is, you may designate a tertiary buyer persona. That's the third most important kind of stakeholder. So again, it depends on how big or how small your company is, and even more so how big or small your accounts are, your clients are, because other things being equal, larger companies are going to have more IT employees, more granular kinds of roles. And because of that, you'll need a more granular approach to how you segment and personalize your marketing. For the 200 to the 1,000 person manufacturing company that may have 8 or 10 people in the IT organization, the good news is at that size, everybody knows everybody. For the most part, everyone is probably working with everyone. So what that means is, yeah, for sure, you'd love to have your downloadable resource guide, your planning guide, your webinar invitation, your breakfast seminar invitation. You'd love to have it land in the perfect person's inbox. You'd love to have it noticed by the perfect person in the LinkedIn feed. But it's a pretty sure bet that in an 8-person IT organization, if you don't get the perfect person who's the second best person, you'll probably get both of them downloading and registering and attending, simply because after they registered, after they downloaded, subscribed, whatever it is, you said, who else? And like, oh, cool. Yeah, actually, this is really good. I'm going to send this to my coworkers. I'm going to send this to my colleagues. I'm going to send this to my boss because I think they'll benefit from this as well. So the smaller the company is, the less precise you need to be. The larger you're selling to at the enterprise size, where you may be selling to IT departments where there may literally be, you go into LinkedIn Sales Navigator and you're selling to companies where there's hundreds, if not thousands of people in an IT organization, you're going to need to get a lot more granular about where they're located, what their job functions are, what seniorities matter most, skills identifiers, all the things that go into building out a really detailed buyer persona and executing against that with a good segmentation strategy that's supported, for example, by your outbound, by LinkedIn Sales Navigator or whatever comparable tools that you're using. Perhaps you're using LinkedIn Campaign Manager to drive ads. And for sure, this segmentation that you're doing is going to be reflected in your drop-down lists on your forms. It'll be addressed as potentially separate pages on your website, separate buttons, separate real estate on your homepage, separate lead generation offers, separate nurturing sequences, separate educational events. So when we're talking about targeting the right people, you're typically trying to get to the point that you have significant surface area on that decision committee. Multiple people from that decision committee consuming your great educational resources and attending your great educational events. Now, notice I take it as a given that you have great educational resources and you have great, amazingly helpful educational events. If you don't, stop right now. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. It's Monopoly board game. And you need to think about, as a company culture, if you're showing up in a way that your prospects and clients want you to be showing up in today's modern self-driven buyer's journey. What does the self-driven buyer's journey mean? This means that your prospects, your clients, even your channel partners, are more allergic to spending time with sales than they ever have at any other point of earlier history. So 10 years ago, it was quite common that your prospects, your clients, your channel partners would spend about half of their research and decision-making process with a member of your sales team. Those days are long gone. 56% of the journey being over before vendor contact or sales contact is now very much in the rearview mirror. Today, it's more like 83%. And again, these are like Gartner numbers. Gartner, and originally the research 10 years ago came from CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, that was acquired by Gartner a couple of years back. What this means is 83% of their research and decision-making is over before they're willing to meet with one of your sales development reps, one of your account executives, something like that. So what that means is it's extremely important, if you want to be the one that shapes the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different telecommunications options in front of them, that we need to understand who these stakeholders are, what they care about, what's going to help them do their job better, what are their biggest goals professionally, as an individual, as a team, as a company, and what are they struggling with the most? And to the extent that you can show up with fantastic, amazingly helpful educational resources and host, sponsor, produce these amazingly helpful educational events. We're not talking about sponsoring other people's events where you're just marginalized into staffing a booth, but educational events where the people that register and attend these events walk away with a jaw-drop moment of, wow, they have some really, really smart, super nice people in their company, and they seem to really know their stuff about anything and everything that has to do with data center telecommunications. For a company that's our size, for a stakeholder like on our team, in our kind of industry, in our kind of region. And yeah, for sure, I'm going to come back next month when they do part 2. I'm going to attend and watch part 2. I'm going to tell my buddies, I'm going to tell my peers, I'm going to tell my boss, I'm going to tell the people on the other teams in our company that they should register, that they should attend as well. And when you do this exceptionally well, you find that your educational resources and your educational events are driving alignments, getting those multiple stakeholders on the decision committee on the same page before they're ready for a sales conversation. And this is when you can have a massive impact on shaping how they research and navigate and compare the different options that are in front of them for anything and everything having to do with telecommunications. You'll know you're doing this well because you've not only stayed on the short list, but over time, they start to consider fewer and fewer competitive options because they're spending so much time with you. They're getting so much value from you. There's no reason for them to look elsewhere. And you'll know this is working well because when you finally get to that 83% point and they're ready for a sales conversation, they're literally quoting your methodology that you taught them for how to evaluate the different telecommunications options. That's where the sales cycle accelerates. You've educated, you've built trust. Not only does the last 17% go well, but onboarding, initial value, intended value, extended value goes really, really well. And they're a thrilled client. They're singing your praises from the rooftop. They essentially become an extension of your team, land and expand, and you've built a client for life because it started with having a strong commitment to educating and building trust and staying with them throughout the full buyer's journey. And we're using the extreme value that we're providing for stakeholders in these companies as essentially the bait, as essentially the incentive for the initial person that you reach to want to bring the rest of their team members with them to that event, to that educational resource experience over and over and over again, that dramatically tips the scales in your favor of doing business with that company. So in terms of targeting the right people, get crisp about that ideal client profile, build out the target account list, research and build out those buyer personas, and do an amazing job of executing world-class educational resources world-class educational events that educate and build trust with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so your prospects and clients see your client-facing team members as the smartest people on the planet when it comes to telecommunications for a data center in their location of roughly their company size and their certain kind of industry, and specifically providing value to these kinds of job functions, these kinds of stakeholders within their company. So that brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value from this week's show so far, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic, a question, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching. So final question, what do we got? So this is in a completely different category relative to the other questions we've addressed this week, and actually in a relatively different category than what we usually address. This is a precast concrete manufacturer. A precast concrete manufacturer, presumably that is making walls and foundations for building data centers faster. So how does a precast concrete manufacturer keep up fast? How does a precast concrete manufacturer keep up with fast data center segment growth? How does a precast concrete manufacturer keep up with fast data center segment growth? I think what it comes down to is being really clear about who you're selling to and getting as close to those folks as possible. And when I talk to people that are in the facilities and the construction and the developments, real estate side of the data center industry, some of the stakeholders that are leading indicators that there's going to be a significant purchase and a significant need for precast concrete would be site selection. Now, for sure, the site selection folks are not the ones that are deciding what kind of concrete is going to be built, but by virtue of the fact that there's some site selection going on is a leading indicator that at some point in the coming weeks or coming months, someone that's also in that ecosystem is likely going to be speccing out precast concrete manufacturing. What else is going on at that point? There's architects involved, design involved, there's general contractors involved, there's real estate investors involved. All of these are leading indicators that at some point, someone in the general contractor is going to at some point be thinking about precast concrete manufacturer. So more than likely, your ideal client profile is going to define clients in a certain geographic area where you can successfully market and sell, and most of all, ship these and deliver these precast concrete walls and floors that make it possible to build data centers faster. Now, for example, if you're located in the Midwest of the United States, how cost effective is it for you to go from that one factory to shipping these walls, shipping these floors, shipping these ceilings to facilities that are in other parts of the world? Probably not, without having facilities there. So there's definitely going to be a geographic part of your ideal client profile. In terms of size, how big or how small does that general contractor, how big or small does that facility need to be at the stage where it's worthwhile for them to engage with your company? Do they need to be a general contractor that has 50 employees, 500 employees, 1,000 employees? Again, only you can answer that question, or maybe they're building their own. We've actually gotten the question multiple times on the show in previous episodes. How do we talk to end user data center clients who want to be their own general contractor, who want to build their own facilities? So we know there's definitely potentially some demand in there as well. So defining that ideal client profile, geographically where they're located, how big or small they are. Industry is probably not as big of a deal if you're not going aggressively after data center end users. But if you are, like, industries within LinkedIn, for example, there's a telecommunications category, there's IT services. There's no data center category per se. There should be, but there isn't. So there's some things that are directly related to that. But for the most part, because you're talking about the facility, a lot of times it's going to be a construction company, a general contractor kind of company, or if you're selling to an end user who's building their own data centers, who is essentially acting as their own general contractor without outsourcing that kind of work. Could a architect, could a design firm have the influence in the materials? Absolutely. So that's a secondary buyer persona, right? Could a developer who has influence on where these projects are ultimately going to go and who the GC is that's actually hired? Sure, there's 4 or 5 different stakeholders that you want to potentially be building relationships with, but at the end of the day, you need to figure out for your particular business model what has worked best. What's been the most direct line of sight? What's been most cost effective? And where have you gotten the best data back, where you built the deepest relationships that help you understand not only keeping up with segment growth, but keeping up with the growth within those individual companies, what they're actively working on. And that comes from having trusted relationships within these accounts, trusted relationships. So the question is, like, if this is not a former coworker of yours, and it's not your brother-in-law or sister-in-law, and it's not a neighbor, how do you build trust? And I think this is where a lot of people in the data center ecosystem and infrastructure, critical facilities, kind of get confused. Because when it comes to a lot of segments within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, there is an obscene amount of money that's spent on national and global conferences, to the point where for a company that's selling precast concrete, I wouldn't be surprised if you told me there's shows that you're going to where you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars or your local currency equivalent on an individual show. What does that look like besides the booth? There's a golf tournament, there's a cabana party poolside. And yeah, some of those things can have value if you're really, really careful about the shows that you invest in to make sure there's a really tight match between your ideal client profile and your primary and secondary buyer personas and their demographics from last year's show and what they anticipate for this year's show. Bear in mind that in most cases, those demographics are not audited. It's a good faith representation, but if their good faith representation doesn't match up with a very high degree of your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas, you may be investing in something that's looking for a needle in a haystack. The challenge with those kinds of events is even when there's a really tight ideal client profile match, what you're essentially looking for is ways to have the attendees see your experts, not as vendors, but actually as subject matter experts, as teachers, as consultants, as trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center construction, specifically the application of when it makes sense to use precast concrete in the design and the construction of data center facilities. And if you just have a booth at that conference, if you're just sponsoring parties or a golf tournament or a 5K or something at that event, you really don't have the opportunity to educate and build trust with people. Sure, they'll have a positive brand halo about it, but that's very, very different than them attending a 45-minute breakout session or a 45-minute webinar or a 45-minute lunch and learn, where you're talking about the state of data center construction best practices, where you're talking about what goes into design, what goes into shell, and best practices for deciding when and how and where to use precast concrete. When you're able to do that well, you get in early, you get in often, and your prospects and clients see your client-facing team members, hopefully, as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center construction and specifically using precast concrete. When you don't do that, you're leaving your company very vulnerable to someone else that is doing that. Because in today's self-driven buyer's journey, whether you're talking about supervisors, executives, architects, designers, developers, regardless of what the role is, people in general just want a much more self-guided journey than they ever have in the past. They're going much, much later into their research and decision-making process before they're willing to schedule time with someone from your sales team, whether it's a sales development, business development, account executive, whatever it is. They're going just much deeper into the journey. So the way we intercept them much earlier on in the journey is we can't just show up as the vendor who wants to sell them precast concrete. We need to show up as the expert who's going to teach them, who's going to provide this amazing workforce development, learning and development, professional development experience that helps them understand how a person in this particular job role at this kind of company in this geographic region at roughly this size navigates all of the adjacent directly and indirectly related issues that have to do with building a data center in their area and potentially deciding how and when to use precast concrete. And when you do this exceptionally well, you'll get a foot in the door in the formative stages with multiple stakeholders from this company that allow them to say, wow, this is really helpful. What else do they have to say? Oh, cool. There's a part 2 coming up next month. 2 of us really enjoyed this. Let's bring the rest of the team with us. Let's see if they'll come in and they'll do a custom lunch and learn, a custom seminar, custom webinar just for members of our team. And when you do this, getting in early and often, you're nearly guaranteed to stay on the short list. You start to proactively knock competitive forces off of that short list because they're just learning so much from you. Why would they want to look elsewhere? They may need to check off a box, but for sure you've won them over. They're already very emotionally connected, emotionally bought into working with your company because of the know, like, and trust. And you'll know this is working exceptionally well because they finally get to the sales kind of meeting and they're quoting your methodology. You were the one that taught them about these data center construction best practices, and specifically where it makes sense to bring in precast concrete and where it doesn't. You've shared the use cases, you've introduced them to some social proof, you've introduced them to others who've been in similar kinds of companies that have navigated these kinds of challenges in the past. So that's how you keep up. Because you're spending so much time with them, you are keeping up with trends. Now, of course, there's a lot of ways to learn about the data center industry. A lot of people say they go to conferences primarily to learn. I would argue that sure, conferences are helpful, but if you have limited budget, if you have limited time, if it's not cost or time working out logistically possible to go to 24, 30 conferences a year, you can learn an awful lot by just attending webinars, by listening to podcasts, by watching podcasts, by engaging in educational kinds of experiences with that. And over time, what you're going to tend to find is the self-guided educational experiences is a significant competitive battleground. In the construction part of the data center segment, they've been a little bit late to the thought leadership content marketing party over the years. You can go back to the early 2010s and see lots of signs of data center operators, especially colocation and hyperscale, investing aggressively in that playbook. You can also go back to the early to mid 2010s and find dozens of examples of company technology and facilities related companies in and around data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities doing a fantastic job with this. So at this point, they have 10 plus years of experience in doing this well. Construction and real estate have been a little late to the party, but the larger companies have been doing this for quite a while, and even the mid-sized companies are warming up to this, and there's now even some events and some ecosystem popping up around this. But I would tell you that you don't necessarily need to invest in paid media and paid events. If you have a good pulse for what your ideal clients and what those buyer personas care most about, for a fraction of the risk, for a fraction of the cost, you can be creating your own media and creating your own events. And a lot of it is just limited by the reach that you currently have in your creativity and ingenuity. If you find that you have a significant amount of data center GCs, general contractors, data center developers, data center investors in your local geographic area, and your office has a conference room that comfortably sits 15, 20 people, or there's a classroom, use that space. It costs almost nothing for you to invite 30, 40 people in the hopes that 15, 20 attend and learn about construction best practices in the data center industry that every general contractor needs to know about, or every data center developer needs to know about, or every data center investor needs to know about, or whatever, one segment at a time. Teach so well that if you were applying to give that talk at a conference, you're highly confident that when you filled out the working title and the abstract, the excerpt, the summary of what you're going to talk about, that the advisory council says, wow, that sounds amazing. Let's put them on the website. And the next step is, okay, 6 or 8 weeks before the conference, they reach out to you. And the conference producer, the advisory council says, we love the title. We love your photo. We love what you're talking about that's on your website. We just want to make sure that you're providing enough value to our audience. So send us your slides 8 weeks before. So that's another check and balance to make sure you're providing helpful educational content so it doesn't turn into an infomercial. That's what they're most fearing, by the way, is that it turns into just a sales pitch. So provide what I call conference grade content that's so good that with all of those checks and balances, and of course the check and balance on the day of the event is the breakout session is set for 60. There's 55 of those 60 seats filled up at the beginning, and 45 minutes later, nearly everyone is still sitting there. They're mesmerized. They're learning a ton. They're taking all these great notes. They're highly engaged and participating in your conversation. And when the mobile app pops up and says, how did you like the conference? They give you a perfect score, and you end up with one of the highest rated sessions in all the conference. Immediately following that session, everyone's coming up to get your card and talk about what they can do to work with you on an ongoing basis. That's conference grade content. And when you don't need a conference producer and an advisory council to achieve a lot of those same outcomes. What you need is the culture and the mentality, the mindset to be client-centric, to provide a ton of value for who you're trying to build these relationships with, what they care most about, and how you can earn your way in early and often as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with that particular job function in that kind of company, in that geographic area, when it comes to data center construction, data center development. And as part of that, the decision that comes about as to deciding how and when they would potentially use precast concrete in the design and the development and the building and the construction of those data center facilities. So that's how I would address how a precast concrete manufacturer can keep up with fast data center segment growth. So that was the final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. If you got good value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic, a question, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching. If you want to make sure that you get notified about educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing email newsletter that comes to your inbox each Sunday. And you can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI. If we're not currently connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me a connect request. Make sure to mention that you are watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. And I'd be happy to be connected with you as part of your LinkedIn network. So we wish you great success in growing your business, regardless of whether you do colocation, infrastructure optimization, decommissioning, data center infrastructure management, DCIM software, telecommunications, or precast hardware, precast concrete manufacturing for critical facilities, for data centers, for digital infrastructure, regardless of where you sit within the ecosystem, regardless of where you sit within the go-to-market team. We wish you great success and look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.